In 1773, the most expensive cup of tea in human history was poured into Boston Harbor. Not drunk, dumped. 46 tons of it, chest after chest cracked open and emptied into the freezing Atlantic water by men who understood, with absolute clarity, that tea was not a beverage, it was a weapon. And they were done being on the wrong end of it. That act of deliberate theatrical destruction, what we now call the Boston Tea Party, sits at the center of a story most people think they already know. They know the dates, they know the names. What they don't know is the machinery underneath. How a single dried leaf created the architecture of the modern world. How it built empires, funded wars, engineered famines, and quietly determined which nations would be rich and which would be poor for the next 2 centuries. That is the story we're telling today, and it starts somewhere most people would never think to look. Before there were empires, before there were trade routes, before there was anything that could reasonably be called civilization in the places that would eventually fight over it, there was a plant, Camellia sinensis, an unremarkable evergreen shrub, waxy leaves, small white flowers. It grew wild in the mountain forests of what is now Yunnan province in southwestern China, at elevations between 4,000 and 7,000 feet, in thin soil, in cool mist, largely unbothered. Nobody planted it. Nobody cultivated it. It had been growing there, in various forms, for millions of years before any human being thought to do anything with it. The first people who interacted with it didn't brew it, they chewed it. Archaeological and botanical evidence suggests that indigenous communities in the Yunnan region were consuming raw tea leaves for energy, for alertness, possibly for mild pain relief, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. The specific compounds responsible for those effects, primarily caffeine and the amino acid L-theanine, were doing their work long before anyone had language for what was happening in their body when they consumed them. The leap from chewing raw leaves to brewing them in hot water was not a single invention. It was a slow accumulation of accident and observation across generations, but Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, already referenced tea as a medicine, a treatment for fatigue, for digestive complaints, for headaches. At this point, it wasn't a drink in any pleasurable sense. It was a prescription, ground into paste, pressed into bricks, boiled with salt and ginger and sometimes onion into something that tasted like medicine, because that is exactly what it was. The transformation from remedy to ritual took centuries. It required one man to notice that something important was being missed. Lu Yu was born around 733 AD during the Tang Dynasty, one of the most culturally sophisticated periods in Chinese history. He was an orphan, raised by Buddhist monks, which meant he grew up inside an institution that had been using tea for centuries, not for pleasure, but for function. Monks needed to stay alert during long meditation sessions. Tea was the tool. But Lu Yu saw something the monks weren't paying attention to. He noticed that the way tea was prepared mattered enormously, that the source of the water changed the flavor, that the temperature of the flame, the shape of the vessel, the grade of the leaf, all of it produced measurably different results. He became, in a sense, the world's first obsessive tea nerd. And then he did something extraordinary. He wrote it all down. In 760 AD, Lu Yu published the Cha Jing, the classic of tea, the first book in human history dedicated entirely to a single beverage. It covered cultivation, processing, water quality ranked by source, the correct vessels for different preparations, the philosophy of attention and presence that proper tea preparation required. What Lu Yu did was not merely document a drink. He elevated it. He gave it a framework. He made tea into an argument that the way you prepared and consumed something said something about the quality of your attention, and by extension, the quality of your mind. The Tang Dynasty emperor noticed. Tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The government had recognized what Lu Yu had articulated. This was not a folk remedy anymore. This was culture, and culture, properly managed, was enormously valuable. Here is something worth pausing on before we go further. Every major civilization that encountered tea independently transformed it into a ceremony. Not just a habit, not just a preference. A ceremony. The Chinese developed the Gongfu tea ceremony, a precise, deliberate ritual of small cups, repeated infusions, and sustained attention to the changing character of the leaf across multiple steepings. The Japanese took the Chinese tradition and compressed it into something even more severe. When the monk Eisai brought powdered green tea back from China in 1191, the Japanese didn't simply adopt it, they interrogated it. Over the next 4 centuries, they developed chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony, into one of the most refined cultural practices in human history. Sen no Rikyu, the 16th century tea master who brought the ceremony to its most celebrated form, built it around 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. The tea room was deliberately small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats, roughly 80 square feet, so that even the most powerful warlords had to bow low upon entering. Rank was left at the door. The room recognized no hierarchy except presence. In Tibet, at elevations above 14,000 feet, where caloric needs are extreme and farming is nearly impossible, butter tea, pocha, made by churning strong tea with yak butter and salt, became a daily survival staple rather than a luxury. The ceremony there was about sustenance, not refinement, but it was still a ceremony. The hospitality logic was the same. To offer tea was to offer yourself. In Morocco, refusing mint tea in someone's home is still considered an insult of the first order. The pouring height, the dramatic arc from pot to glass, is deliberate. It creates the froth. The froth signals care. Every culture that touched this plant built a ritual around it. That is not coincidence. That is the plant doing something to human behavior that we have never fully accounted for. The specific combination of caffeine and L-theanine produces a state of alert calm, focused but not anxious, energized but not frantic, that is genuinely unlike anything else in the natural world. People didn't just enjoy tea, they organized their inner lives around what it did to them, which is what made it so dangerous when empires noticed. The British East India Company was not sentimental about tea. By the mid-17th century, tea had arrived in England through Dutch traders and been adopted enthusiastically by the aristocracy, partly because Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who married King Charles II in 1662, drank it obsessively and made it fashionable at court. Within a generation, it had moved from aristocratic affectation to national habit. Tea houses opened across London. The East India Company, which had built its early fortune on spices and textiles, recognized the shift and pivoted aggressively. Tea became its most profitable product. And then they hit the problem. China, the only source of tea on earth, did not want anything Britain had to sell. The Qianlong Emperor made this explicit in a letter to King George III in 1793. China, the emperor wrote, possessed all things in prolific abundance. British manufactures were neither required nor desired. The trade was entirely one-directional, British silver flowing into China in exchange for tea, silk and porcelain, with nothing flowing back. By the early 19th century, this imbalance had become a national crisis. The British Treasury was hemorrhaging silver. The East India Company's balance sheets were catastrophic. Something had to give. What gave was ethics. British traders, operating through the East India Company's infrastructure in India, began cultivating opium poppies in Bengal and smuggling the processed drug into China in exchange for tea. It was a closed loop of devastating elegance. Indian opium bought Chinese tea was sold in Britain, British profits funded more Indian opium. The East India Company did not merely permit this trade, it organized it, protected it, scaled it. By the 1830s, an estimated 2 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. The social devastation was visible at every level of Chinese society, from peasant villages to the imperial bureaucracy. When the Chinese government finally moved to stop it, appointing Commissioner Lin Zexu to enforce a crackdown, Lin seized and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton Harbour in 1839. Britain declared war. The First Opium War lasted 3 years. Britain won comprehensively. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade, pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, and cede Hong Kong to the British Crown. A second war followed from 1856 to 1860, with similarly humiliating results for China. What is worth sitting with here, really sitting with, is the chain of causation. Britain wanted tea. China wouldn't accept British goods in return. Britain found something China's population would consume regardless of official policy. The resulting addiction crisis destabilized a civilization. The attempt to stop it triggered 2 wars. Those wars redrew the map of Asia and set in motion a century of Chinese humiliation at the hands of Western powers, a wound that shaped Chinese political identity so profoundly that its reverberations are still being felt in the geopolitics of the 21st century. All of that connects back to a dried leaf. But Britain wasn't finished. The wars solved the immediate trade deficit. They did not solve the underlying vulnerability, complete dependence on a foreign monopoly for the commodity that held the empire together. The solution they devised was one of the most audacious acts of corporate espionage in recorded history. In 1848, the East India Company commissioned a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune for a mission that, stated plainly, sounds like the plot of a spy novel. Fortune was to travel into the interior of China, regions strictly forbidden to foreigners, steal the tea plant, steal the processing knowledge, and transplant the entire industry to British India. Fortune shaved his head, grew out a braided queue, dressed in the clothing of a Chinese mandarin from a distant province, travelled with 2 Chinese servants whose job was to maintain his cover if questioned. He journeyed deep into the tea-growing regions of Fujian province and the Wuyi Mountains, areas where the processing techniques that gave Chinese tea its character had been refined and jealously guarded across generations. He did not take a few cuttings and leave. He spent months. He documented oxidation processes, firing temperatures, rolling techniques, the specific timing and sequence of steps that transformed a fresh leaf into the finished product the British market demanded. He collected over 20,000 seedlings and approximately 17,000 germinated seeds, packed into specially designed Wardian cases, sealed glass containers that could maintain a controlled environment across a months-long ocean voyage. He also recruited 8 Chinese tea masters, men who carried the processing knowledge in their hands, and persuaded them to relocate to India. Fortune brought everything to Darjeeling, in the foothills of the Himalayas, where elevations, rainfall patterns, and temperature ranges closely mirrored the conditions that produced China's finest teas. He also sent material to Assam in northeastern India, where a wild variety of the tea plant had already been discovered growing naturally in 1823. Within 2 decades, Indian tea production had not merely caught up with China, it had surpassed it for the British market. The cost of that transformation was not borne by the British. Plantation labour in Assam and in Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, where tea cultivation expanded rapidly in the 1870s after a fungal disease destroyed the island's coffee crop, was brutal by any standard that admits the word. Tamil workers brought from southern India to Ceylon were contracted under systems that functioned, in practice, as indentured labour. They lived in plantation housing controlled by the estate. They were paid wages calculated to prevent accumulation. They could not leave without settling debts that were structured to be unsettlable. The communities that were uprooted and transplanted to serve British tea demand did not share in the profits of what they built. Their descendants in Sri Lanka remained stateless, denied citizenship by the Ceylonese government after independence, until legislative reforms decades later that were themselves incomplete. The cup of tea that built the British Empire was grown, picked, and processed by people who received almost none of what it was worth. Pay attention here, because this is the part most histories of tea skip over. While Britain was restructuring Asian agriculture through a combination of espionage and colonial labour policy, tea was doing something entirely different on the other side of the Atlantic. American colonists in the 1770s consumed tea in quantities that rivaled Britain itself. It was their most popular non-alcoholic beverage, and the British Parliament had decided to make it a political instrument. The Tea Act of 1773 gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies and embedded within it a tax that colonists had no representation in approving. The principle at stake was not the tax itself. The taxed price was actually lower than what smuggled Dutch tea had cost. The principle was the precedent. Parliament was asserting the right to legislate for people who had no voice in the legislation. On the night of December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. 46 tons, worth roughly $1.7 million in today's money, gone. The British response, the coercive acts that closed Boston Harbor and suspended Massachusetts self-governance, radicalized colonial opinion faster than any pamphlet could have managed. Within 2 years, the American Revolution had begun. What is stranger and more lasting is what happened to tea itself in America. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea was associated with loyalty to the crown. Patriots switched to coffee. The cultural substitution became identity. The United States became, and has remained, one of the very few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea, not because Americans have different palates, but because a generation decided that what you drank said something about who you were politically. Tea made America, and then America rejected tea, for reasons that had nothing to do with flavor. The 20th century brought tea to scales that would have been incomprehensible to Lu Yu. In 1904, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, a tea merchant named Richard Bleckenden was attempting to sell hot tea to fairgoers in the middle of a Missouri summer. Nobody was interested. He poured it over ice. Iced tea was born, or at least industrialized, and today accounts for roughly 80% of all tea consumed in the United States. In 1908, a New York merchant named Thomas Sullivan began sending tea samples to customers in small silk pouches. Customers, assuming the pouch was meant to be submerged whole, dumped it directly into hot water. It worked. Sullivan switched to cheaper gauze. The teabag industry followed, and with it, a democratization of convenience that drove consumption to volumes no previous era had approached. In India, chai, black tea brewed strong with milk, sugar, cardamom, ginger, and cloves, became not just a national drink, but a national institution. Chai wallas, street vendors operating from carts and storefronts across every Indian city, became as fundamental to the urban landscape as any piece of architecture. In Turkey, which had lost access to its traditional coffee supply regions when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, tea cultivation was deliberately expanded as a matter of national policy. The government subsidized production in the eastern Black Sea region. Within decades, Turkey had rebuilt its daily ritual around tea rather than coffee. Today, Turkey consumes more tea per capita than any other nation on earth, over 6.5 pounds per person per year. In Tibet, butter tea remained what it had always been, survival in a cup, at altitudes where survival is the primary daily concern. One plant, every one of these traditions, every one of these histories, produced by the same species, Camellia sinensis, differentiated only by how the leaf is handled after picking. Green tea is heated quickly to stop oxidation. The leaf stays green. The flavor stays grassy, vegetal, clean. Black tea is fully oxidized before drying. The leaf darkens. The flavor deepens into the malt and tannin that Britain built its empire on. Oolong falls between, partially oxidized, the processing stopped at a specific moment to produce a flavor that exists nowhere else on the spectrum. White tea is the least processed of all, the youngest buds, dried with minimal intervention, retaining a delicacy that disappears the moment you do anything more to them. Same plant, same leaves, nothing but time and temperature and intention separating a cup of Darjeeling First Flush from a bag of supermarket breakfast tea. Today, tea is produced in more than 50 countries. Global production exceeds 6.5 million tons annually. Over 2 billion people drink it every day. In Kenya, tea is the single largest export crop. In Assam, more than 800 estates cover nearly 800,000 acres. The global tea industry generates over $200 billion a year. Every leaf of it traces back to the same mountain forests of Yunnan, where nobody was paying attention to a wild shrub with waxy leaves and small white flowers. The people who drink it tomorrow morning, the ones who brew it without thinking, who let the bag steep too long, who drink it from a thermos in traffic, are connected, without knowing it, to Tang dynasty scholars arguing about water temperature, to Japanese samurai who believed a bowl of tea could teach them something about mortality, to British soldiers in the trenches of the Somme for whom a cup of tea was the only reliable signal that the world still had ordinary things in it. Winston Churchill reportedly considered tea more important to military morale than ammunition. The British government agreed. Tea was among the first commodities rationed during both World Wars, with rationing designed specifically to guarantee supply rather than restrict it. That is the measure of what this leaf meant. Not a luxury. A necessity, not comfort, infrastructure. If this video changed how you think about something you drink without thinking, the subscribe button is right there. This channel covers the hidden machinery behind the things that shape the world, and there is a great deal more machinery left to cover. The wars fought over this leaf, the espionage committed to control it, the labor extracted to produce it, the revolutions it catalyzed, all of that is carried inside something most people treat as completely unremarkable. Tea is not ordinary. It never was. What surprises me, genuinely, the more time I spent inside this story, is not that empires fought over it. It is that we forgot they did. That the distance between the harbour in Boston and the mountain forests of Yunnan, and the plantation labour of Assam, and the opium dens of Canton, all collapsed into something we buy in a box at a grocery store without a second thought. The world was remade by this plant. Most mornings we drink it and think about something else entirely. Drop a comment below. Which part of this story surprised you most? The Opium Wars connection? Robert Fortune's espionage? The fact that all tea comes from a single species? I want to know what landed. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, the next video covers the commodity that did to the 20th century what tea did to the 18th. You will not see the connection coming until it hits you.